This war is not coming, it's already being built. Not on the battlefield, not in the desert, but inside systems of money, influence, and power. Because the uncomfortable truth is this: wars like this don't start by accident. They are pushed, slowly, quietly, relentlessly. And in this case, there are three forces pulling the United States toward Iran. The first is what you might call the war lobby networks of influence with money, access, and long-term strategic interests. In Washington, one of the most powerful lobbying groups has over 100,000 high-level members, many of them extremely wealthy, including billionaires. Alongside them are millions more religious blocs, political donors, and aligned institutions. They don't fight wars themselves, but they shape the direction of policy. Different motivations, but the same destination. The second force is less visible, but far more powerful: money. Because modern empires no longer run on territory alone. They run on flow. Oil flows, trade flows, capital flows. Right now, nearly 40% of global oil shipments pass through the Middle East. And when that flow is threatened, markets don't just panic, they move. Volatility creates speculation. Speculation creates profit. On paper, instability is a risk. In reality, it's also an opportunity. Entire sectors of the financial system benefit from uncertainty. And that creates a dangerous incentive. The longer the tension, the greater the gain. The third force is the oldest one of all power, because no leader wants to look weak, especially not in front of the world. History shows this again and again. In 2003, the United States launched a war in Iraq, expecting a quick victory. 3 weeks to win, that was the promise. Instead, the war lasted nearly 9 years and cost over $2 trillion. But here's the problem. The belief never really changed that with enough force, enough technology, enough confidence, you can control the outcome. And this is where things start to become dangerous. Because when you combine influence, money, and power, you don't get a careful decision-making process. You get momentum, a system that begins to move on its own. And once that momentum starts, it doesn't stop to ask whether war is necessary or even rational. It only asks one question: how far are you willing to go? Because at this point, this is no longer about whether the United States wants a war with Iran. It's about whether it can still avoid one. And that is a very different question. Let's say it's March 2027. The tension has been building for months. Protests inside Iran, attacks in the Red Sea, oil prices rising, headlines everywhere. And then one night, the president goes live on television. He speaks calmly, confident, direct. He says the Iranian regime is collapsing, that thousands of civilians are being killed in protests, that the world cannot stand by and watch. He says intelligence confirms Iran is weeks away from building nuclear weapons, not one, but several, enough to threaten entire cities. He says global trade is under attack, that nearly 40% of the world's oil supply is at risk. And finally, he says the United States has a responsibility to protect its allies, to defend global stability, and to act before it's too late. It sounds familiar because we've heard it before, but this time it moves faster. Within days, a coalition forms. The United Kingdom joins. Regional partners mobilize. Bases activate. Carriers deploy. And somewhere in the Arabian Sea, a 100,000-ton warship begins to move silent, controlled, unstoppable, designed not just to fight wars, but to end them. Air dominance is established almost immediately. Satellites, drones, surveillance systems, everything locks into place. Nothing moves in the sky without being seen. Nothing launches without being tracked. The battlefield becomes transparent. Then the next phase begins. Transport aircraft start landing. Heavy equipment arrives. Marines, mechanized units. Special forces already inside the country begin marking targets, airfields, missile systems, communication hubs. Within a very short time, tens of thousands of troops are on the ground, possibly more. From the south, forces push inland. Supply lines stretch across desert routes, naval forces secure the coastline, and slowly, methodically, a presence is established. At this point, everything looks exactly like the plan. The United States controls the sky. It controls the sea. It has troops inside the country. Allies are aligned. The operation appears clean, efficient, under control. And if you're watching this on television, it feels like victory is already decided. Because this is what modern war is supposed to look like. Fast, precise, overwhelming. But this is also where the illusion begins, because what you're seeing is only the surface. On paper, this is dominance. In reality, it's exposure. The troops on the ground are not advancing into open terrain. They are moving into one of the most difficult environments on Earth. Mountains, narrow passes, layered defensive zones. A country designed by geography to absorb invasion, not collapse under it. And more importantly, the numbers don't add up. Iran has a population of nearly 90 million people. To control a country that size, Military theory suggests you would need several million troops, not tens of thousands, not even hundreds of thousands, millions. But that's not what's happening here. Instead, you have a relatively small force deep inside hostile territory, spread across vast distances, relying on long and fragile supply lines. And this is where the situation starts to shift. Because in traditional warfare, there are three rules you cannot break. You must concentrate your forces, you must avoid being surrounded, and you must protect your supply lines. Break any one of those, and you're in trouble. Break all three, and you're not an army anymore. You're trapped, and that's exactly what begins to happen. The deeper the forces move, the harder it becomes to support them. Roads are limited. Terrain slows everything down. Air resupply becomes risky. Every movement becomes predictable. Every route becomes vulnerable. And slowly, almost invisibly at first, the advantage starts to disappear. What looked like a forward operation starts to feel like an insertion. What looked like control starts to look like containment. And then you realize something. This entire strategy, the speed, the precision, the early dominance, it only works if the enemy collapses quickly, if resistance breaks, if the system falls apart from the inside. But what if it doesn't? What if instead of collapsing, it hardens? What if the population doesn't welcome the invasion, but resists it? What if the terrain doesn't slow the enemy, but traps you? Because at that moment, everything changes. The same forces that made the invasion look unstoppable, speed, distance, deep penetration, now become the exact reasons it cannot be reversed. You're too far in, too spread out, too dependent on lines you cannot fully protect. And that's the point most people miss. Because when you look at this moment, air superiority, troops on the ground, control of key zones, it looks like the war has already been won. But in reality, this is the moment it has already been lost. At this point, the situation doesn't collapse all at once. It tightens, not like an explosion, more like a slow, controlled pressure building from every direction. Because once troops are inside, the question is no longer how to win the war. It becomes much simpler. How do you leave? And that's where history starts to repeat itself. Because this isn't the first time a powerful force has walked into a situation like this, convinced it could control the outcome. Go back to ancient Greece, 415 BC. Athens was one of the most powerful states in the world, wealthy, confident, dominant at sea, and in the middle of a long war, they made a decision that seemed logical at the time: invade Sicily. The argument was simple. Sicily had resources. Taking it would weaken their enemy, strengthen their position, end the war faster. So they sent a massive expedition, ships, soldiers, supplies. At first, everything looked fine. They landed, established control, pressured the enemy. But there was one problem they didn't fully understand: distance. Because once they were there, far from home, everything depended on resupply. And the moment that supply was disrupted, the entire force collapsed. The army wasn't defeated in one battle. It was slowly isolated, cut off, surrounded. And in the end, it was destroyed. That single decision didn't just lose a campaign. It ended an empire. Now fast forward. Most Americans had never even heard of Vietnam. It was distant, irrelevant, a small conflict on the other side of the world. Less than a decade later, over 500,000 American troops were inside that country, fighting a war that leadership already knew could not be won. The documents came out years later, the Pentagon Papers, and they revealed something uncomfortable. The war didn't continue because it was working. It continued because it couldn't stop. Too much had already been invested. Too many lives, too much money, too much political capital. Leaving would mean admitting failure. So instead they stayed. And the deeper they went, the harder it became to get out. That's what we call the sunk cost trap. And once you're inside it, logic doesn't matter anymore. Only momentum. Now look at more recent conflicts. In modern warfare, there is a pattern: initial success, followed by overextension, followed by resistance, and then slow entrapment. Because wars are not decided at the moment of entry. They are decided by what happens after, by logistics, by terrain, by will, and in a place like Iran, those factors don't favor the invader. They favor the defender. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Because this isn't just about military strategy, it's about incentives. Different actors, different goals, all moving in the same direction, but for completely different reasons. The United States wants to remove a hostile regime. Iran wants to draw the United States into a prolonged conflict, one it can't easily exit. But then there are others watching, calculating. Because in a scenario where both sides are pulled into a long, exhausting war, something else happens. Power shifts, influence changes, and for some players, that outcome is not a risk, it's an opportunity. Because if one side gets weakened and the other side gets weakened, someone else fills the space. That's the part no one says out loud. that sometimes the most advantageous position is not to win the war, but to let others fight it. And this is where the final layer comes in, because eventually the situation reaches a point where there are no clean options left. If you escalate, you risk something bigger. If you withdraw, you lose credibility. If you stay, you bleed resources. Every path leads to cost. And that's when extreme options start to enter the conversation. Threats, ultimatums, escalation. Because when conventional strategies fail, leaders look for leverage. But even that has limits, because once other powers get involved directly or indirectly, the space for escalation narrows. Suddenly, actions that once seemed possible become too dangerous. And that creates a kind of strategic lock, where you're committed but constrained, engaged but unable to finish. And that is the most dangerous position any country can be in. Not losing quickly, not winning decisively, but stuck. Because at that point, the war stops being a conflict and becomes a system, one that feeds on time, resources, and attention, one that expands without resolution, one that no longer needs a clear objective to continue. And that brings us back to the beginning, because this was never just about one decision. It was about a chain, a sequence of incentives, pressures, and assumptions, all pointing in the same direction. And once that chain is in motion, it becomes very difficult to break, because leaving doesn't just require strategy, it requires admitting something no system likes to admit, that it was wrong. And that is the hardest thing of all. So the real question isn't how this war starts, it's what happens when it doesn't end.